The anthropological approach can be seen as simply paying attention to the everyday and making the familiar strange. The anthropologist makes connections between smaller and larger events, consistently questioning their own bias and position, and is never afraid of paradox. Simply put, anthropology deals with the ways in which we categorize the world around us, how we form theories of the world through context, content, and logic. In recent years, anthropology has increasingly turned towards art and multimedia to explore different cultures and their ways of categorization. As Tillich argues, such methods, such as the use of image, allow certain concepts to become porous and loose from the rigidity of academic language. At its best, these artful approaches free us from the colonial idea of freezing cultures into a specific image and not accepting that they can change. In this sense, Kendrick Lamar is hip-hop's anthropologist. His use of music and poetry to explore African American culture acts as a self-reflective body of work that permits an idea of hip-hop and Black America as ever-changing and fluid. As James B.A.L. writes, Kendrick offers a new way of thinking about hip-hop as a whole, not simply as a capitalistic enterprise or as a black news channel, but as a distinct method for collecting data and understanding the experiences and existence of Black people. Not only is Kendrick an anthropologist, his concerns, entrenched in the philosophical topics of Black nihilism, ontology, theology, and free will, also reflect an existentialist approach to his work. In this sense, Kendrick Lamar uses an anthropological lens to diagnose the symptoms of hip-hop, and through this offers a potential cure against systemic oppression, self-doubt, death anxiety, and his own pitfalls by way of existentialism. Undoubtedly, Kendrick Lamar is hip-hop's existential anthropologist. So what's his thesis? Kendrick's last 4 albums follow a specific semi-autobiographical journey. In Good Kid, M.A.A.d City, Kendrick reveals to us his roots, his coming-of-age story in Compton. In To Pimp a Butterfly, he reveals that his success has only brought him guilt from leaving those in Compton behind, and recounts the struggles of dealing with the chronic social and personal threats that Black Americans face at all levels of status in America. In Damn, Kendrick plunges into the anxiety, wrestling with the extent to which he and African Americans can choose their fate despite generational bonds of cruelty. And in his latest album, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, Kendrick turns inwards, affirming what he values the most in life and shedding his image as a savior. Throughout the journey, Kendrick invites feelings of uneasiness, dread, paradox, and tension to offer the listener a chance to feel what he's feeling. And one of the main methods behind this strategy is actually a form of anthropological analysis, the autoethnography. James Haile describes the autoethnographic account as a method by which the author is deeply and personally tied to a certain experience. This involves reflexivity, how a researcher relates to a field and what they bring to the research experience. Today's video is sponsored by Blinkist. School's out and I can already feel the seductive call of streaming services and video game sessions. It's crazy how quickly I can toss aside that giant reading list that I've amassed throughout the school year. I mean, shouldn't I relax? How much time do I really have this summer? Those were my thoughts before I found Blinkist, which condenses entire books and, more importantly, powerful ideas into just 15 minutes of the most important highlights. Blinkist lets you save time, money, and helps you discover and understand the world around you faster than ever. Blinkist has over 3,000 nonfiction books, 14 million active users, and lets you access all of your titles well offline. Now there's also shortcasts that condense popular podcasts to the heart of each episode. I enjoy Blinkist most when I wake up. Right now I'm listening to Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, a book that details the racial caste system of the US and how it relates to the caste systems of World War II Germany and India. I found the book to be an amazing historical investigation into how present race relations formed, and I felt that Wilkerson offered some very practical and thoughtful solutions to such problems. Right now, Blinkist has a special offer just for our audience. Click the link in my description to start your free 7-day trial with Blinkist and get 25% off of a premium membership. Notably, the goal of anthropology is not to eliminate bias. If such a goal was even possible, the end result of the task would logically end in an incredibly reductionist attempt at defining culture. Instead, the anthropologist explores their own biases as well as the biases of others in order to clarify certain possibilities and limits within the culture of interest. Kendrick's positionality, the space in which he operates, is very unique. He grew up in one of the roughest areas in America, where gang violence and drug trafficking offer little hope for many of the young people born into such a world. At the same time, Kendrick is a rapper who doesn't necessarily have to experience the brutality of those in Compton. He has both experienced the hardships of his people and has the capability of observing and authoring the story of the experience from a distance. This reflects the words of sociologist Carolyn Ellis. As an autoethnographer, I am both the author and focus of the story, the one who tells and the one who experiences, the observer and the observed, the creator and the created. Throughout Good Kid, M.A.A.d City, as well as his following records, Kendrick does not shy away from sharing his own experiences, as well as being the voice of the unheard. He alters his voice, shifts between characters, real and fictional, and blends these varied and distinct personal experiences in Compton to allow for the emergence of certain universal themes. There is no attempt to bridge the self with the outside world or appeal to white listeners. Instead, Kendrick uses emotion to transmit embedded and embodied knowledge. The listener does not need to experience his lyrics personally because Kendrick's storytelling already offers a space to feel the pain of himself and others. For example, in Sing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst, Kendrick inhabits the voice of Keisha's sister, to criticize the very fact that he's using her voice for his autoethnographic account. The sister of Keisha, who was murdered by a John, is shown here as unhappy with Lamar's public retelling of the event in previous albums. This song serves to express a unique question. Does the very methodology he uses allow us to arrive at a coherent truth, or is it simply exploitation? Here, Kendrick does the work of a good anthropologist, questioning his own biases to truly express the Black experience. As Haile writes, in sharing other stories and telling them from his voice, Lamar generates what might be overlooked by the perspectives, what is stated or left unstated. And, in the end, if he is successful, and even if he is not, he might have nevertheless developed a coherent narratological framework to express those elements of human life that unifies experience, but also creates avenues for new ideas of what constitutes reality. Lamar champions social change above mere data collection. To tell these stories is to potentially change the future. He must sing about the unheard, and he asks for those to sing about himself. But how can a rap song change a future that for Black Americans appears so bleak and hopeless? To Pimp a Butterfly finds Kendrick in a state of great success after Good Kid, M.A.A.d City. This success, however, brought with it a certain separation from the brutality and ever-presence of death in his childhood Compton. And yet, as we find throughout the album, the reality of a dominant white culture constantly threatening the biological and cultural existence of African Americans remains, whether he's watching his friends die from police brutality or seeing his very art form corrupted by white industry. To Pimp a Butterfly is to take something beautiful and pervert it. This threat is best captured in Cornel West's Death Shudder. West recounts a dangerous bridge that only the Black school children and him had to cross every day. Each day he feared the bridge snapping, ensuring a sudden death. He knew that if the bridge was regularly crossed by white kids, that the problem would be addressed. In the same anthropological fashion as Geertz, who uses thick description to extract cultural data from a micro-situation, West uses the bridge to symbolize the devaluing of Black lives. The end product of this is the Death Shudder, the constant threat that Black Americans feel against their very existence. This threat of death, or finitude as Tillich would describe it, is one of the main themes of To Pimp a Butterfly. Lamar knows that his fame does little in protecting him from the prospect of death. His friends and family back home are still surrounded by violence. He still has some enemies ready to kill him. And in hood politics, he views these problems as largely systemic, using the parallel of government housing and animals in a zoo to illustrate the confined spaces in which gangs operate, and drives home the impossibility of safety and the constant threat of death. He also emphasizes the little hope that Black Americans have to begin with, using Wesley's theory to explore the lack of financial education offered to his people, perpetuating a cycle of poverty that offers fertile grounds for violence. The product of this finitude is, of course, anxiety. In You, Kendrick struggles with how one should deal with this constant threat. The apparent godlessness of the world offered to Black Americans leads to the worship of temporary idols, such as drugs, money, and sex. In Mama, he truly confronts the anxiety in a Tillichian fashion, taking the voices of others to let him know that he truly knows nothing. He is reminded of the terror that his relatives experience daily. In Blacker the Berry, and in accordance with the theories of another existential anthropologist, Ernest Becker, he sees the majority white cultures overcoming its own anxiety over finitude by elevating their culture above Black culture. White culture survives on the elimination of his culture and people, and this is the root of his anxiety. Tillich argues that the anxiety of finitude is productive. As James McLeod Jr. writes, Tillich remained convinced that even in the midst of experiencing the anxiety of finitude, there remained a force within the darkness that gave all people the courage simply to be in the face of non-being. Tillich terms this existential anguish metaphysical shock, and calls the experience of courage to be the new being. Lamar is aware of the lack of efficacy of the temporal pleasures in reducing his anxiety. In All Right, he recognizes some position that hope or God plays in finding the courage to be, in finding a higher purpose. I draws on several images of death, of the threats that Black Americans constantly experience, and in the end affirms that these reminders of finitude only further emphasize the beauty of him and his people. His self-affirmation against the odds, in total confrontation with the death shudder, ends in the declaration, "And I love myself." The task of self-affirmation over finitude isn't an easy one. This is the theme of Damn, an album that begins with Kendrick attempting to help a blind lady. Suddenly, she shoots him and tells him that he has lost his life. Some have taken this to symbolize the blind lady Justice, whose seeming disability is revealed as a wild inability, according to Devin Johnson. Kendrick's innocence and naivety is lost here, and the world is revealed as a wretched place for those of his kind. This intro suggests an atmosphere of Black nihilism, which describes the situation of African Americans having to creatively organize their reality beyond the anti-Black values endorsed in the world Kendrick has explored in his previous album. The album is an answer to this nihilism. How can we create new values within the void? Frantz Fanon wrote extensively regarding the responsibility of each generation in discovering or fulfilling its unique historical mission or new values. This task comes with it both the accomplishments and shortcomings of previous generations. He suggests that all generations of Black people should work together in creating new values beyond anti-Black racism, an objective that requires a great deal of maturation beyond pure rejection or a pessimistic inversion of whiteness. In this sense, Damn engages directly with the issues of Black maturity. Popular hip-hop tends to promote money, sex, materialism, and temporal pleasures. These false idols allow for a momentary escape from an oppressive world, but fail to directly address Black maturity and responsibility. Black self-affirmation must go beyond material acquisition. This is apparent in Kendrick's questioning of whether wickedness and weakness can be overcome. To view the world and oneself as wicked is to become wicked, and find false idols in a decadent lifestyle of gangbanging, trafficking, and crime out of spite. To view the world and oneself as weak is to see the wicked as victims of circumstance and systemic issues, and from this, to hopefully strive for some strength. This dichotomy is apparent in the contrast between titles such as Love and Lust, and Humble and Pride. It also reflects a question of destiny versus free will. In Duckworth, Anthony Tiffith is planning a robbery of a KFC where Kendrick's father is working. Kendrick's father, Ducky, came from a family of gangsters and pimps, and Kendrick argues that his very DNA holds the curse of wickedness. Ducky also knew that the KFC was robbed before, presenting us with an atmosphere of violence and crime. Nonetheless, his father gave Anthony free food, and his generosity saves both himself and Anthony from becoming another statistic. They are the only of their generation to survive the violence of the area. More importantly, his father breaks the curse of wickedness by choosing the right thing, processing and digesting poverty's dialect to avoid further suffering. Kendrick's discography, from Good Kid, M.A.A.d City to the present album, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, can be seen as a slow, self-reflective journey inward, a journey to find peace inside and outside. His latest work is a logical extension of where we left off in Damn. The only way to truly find the strength to change generational curses is to confront the weakness and wickedness within one's present behavior. Throughout the album, Kendrick recounts his experience with therapy, exploring his inherited tendencies towards homophobia, adultery, misogyny, materialism, and even the savior complex that has emerged through his position as one of the greatest rappers in his generation. The album is organized in 2 discs. Mr. Morale reflects Kendrick's struggles with fame, success, and the weight of being seen as a savior or prophet for his community. This is him standing in the mirror, a ritual he reportedly does for 30 minutes each morning as a form of meditation. Here we also see Kodak Black featured, a rapper who assaulted a woman in 2016. The feature does not function as an apology. Rather, Kendrick appears to be showcasing Kodak as a symptom of generational abuse, a man who was abused and then perpetuated such abuse. However, Kendrick also makes sure to state that him and Kodak are alike. This discussion is connected to Mother I Sober, a heartbreaking account of the cycle of family trauma, exploring his own treatment of women, the abuse of his mother, and his own insecurities surrounding his manhood. He concludes that breaking this cycle requires forgiveness, forgiving himself and others, including the abusers. How does he arrive here? The second half, The Big Steppers, introduces one of Kendrick's spiritual advisors, Eckhart Tolle, the author of The Power of Now. Tolle argues that the way to live is through the present moment. From this, he suggests that people's emotional issues are emergent in their heavy identifications with their own minds or egos. Kendrick even states, "Ego must die, but I let it purge," a sentence that could easily show up in any one of Tolle's books. For Kendrick, it is the ridding of the ego that will allow for peace and forgiveness, breaking the curse. In this sense, The Big Steppers can be seen as Kendrick's journey with his family, resolving with his family intact and him embracing his role not as a savior, but as a man among the people, asking for unconditional love from his fans rather than support contingent on whether he satisfies their own idea of who he is and what he should do. Kendrick frees his ego, accepting the past in order to free himself in the present. Ironically, he must choose himself to do so. In existential fashion, Kendrick has left an autoethnographical trace of his journey through life in which he has grappled with the anxiety of mortality and freedom, the ghouls of nihilism, and has surmounted the temporal idols of wickedness and weakness to instead affirm himself and his destiny as a provider, as a lover, as a man who deeply cares about humanity above and beyond himself, and has recognized, paradoxically, that any change must start with a compassionate confrontation with oneself.